Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today I am here with another palettes on the shopping blog. Do I actually need them? I am here with another two Anastasia palettes. We have the Amrezy palette as well as the Jackie Aina palette. So these two are the ones I want to tackle today. So I'm going to do the same as last time. I am going to go through these palettes. I'm going to swatch them out on my arm. I'm going to start with the Amrezy palette, I think. And then I will take palettes that I think are similar to it and place it next to it. And I will compare the swatches to see if I do actually need these palettes in my collection or if they are redundant. So before jumping into that, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. I would love to have you in the family. Let's jump into the video. So first up, we have the comparison here with the Utopian Dream from Pat McGrath. I feel like there's a lot of overlapping shades in one way and not in another way. It does have a lot of those kind of pinkier tones, I guess, like these two here. Like actually all four of these I've included in swatches. I also included like the bronze and the pink and the deep brown and this, but these two shades aren't really there, and also this one has less shades, so none of the kind of warmer toned browns or anything that is in this palette is in this palette. But I have swatched out the two comparisons right here so you can see what they look like. So these two are them right here. I'm actually going to hold it up here to see better. So you can see the comparisons. There are definitely a couple of overlaps, especially over on this end here. I feel like this is the best example of a version of Barb. This is Barb right here, and this one looks so lackluster next to the Pat McGrath shade, but they're actually very, very similar in tone. Obviously this one is my preference, but you know, there's a good comparison. This one here is also like a similar shade of purple. This one has a blue shift to it though. We have the gold tone there, which is actually quite similar as well. The bronzes are also similar. This one here is actually a multi-chrome. I don't know if you can pick it up. I don't think you can in this lighting. But this one has like a pink main shift that goes into green. But I'll compare it to the pink in the palette, which isn't obviously the same, but I thought I'd compare them anyway. And then these two are also quite different. And then over on this end here, the only thing that we really have is similar is this brown, which is a little bit more pink toned than this one here, but I thought it was worth comparing anyway. So that is the first palette compared. The second palette that I'm comparing it to today is the Huda Beauty Mercury R Grey palette. They aren't super similar, but there's a couple overlapping shades. So here are the comparisons. I'm just going to hold it up because I think you can see it better. So here are the shades. So let's go through them in order. First up, we have these two shades here, which are quite similar. This one is slightly more purple leaning. This one is slightly warmer leaning, but yeah, very, very similar. These two are also very, very similar, almost exact right there. This here, which is the shade Karma, I thought would be more similar to OG, but it's not. This one is way more kind of peachy pink, whereas these two are very orangey. This shade here also isn't exact, but they are like similar vibes. This one just doesn't have a shift to it like this does, but this one is more reflective. The pinks as well aren't the same. This one is more brighter. This one is a duochrome. Moving on to the bronze. The bronze here in the Anastasia palette is definitely like deeper and not as sparkly. But I like this one more. We don't have any pressed glitters. Then these two kind of shades here, I'm going to cover them together. The blue and the purple are, you know, obviously there's a blue and there's a purple in both palettes, but they are different undertones in both. But I just wanted to compare them anyway. This one is quite similar, not exact, but there's definitely more similarities between these two than these two here, I would say. And then lastly, we have this here, which is like more like a setting shade. So nothing exciting, but again, a few overlapping shade, nothing too much. Next up, I'm comparing the palette to the Metropolis palette, and at first glance, you might not think these are super similar. And yes, there's definitely a lot of differences, but there's a couple shades that I feel like are pretty similar. And I have swatched the most similar shades out right here. So if you separate the palette, this one is definitely more autumnal, not as like pink leaning as this top row here, but there's definitely a few similar shades, especially like these here. You have those like more warm tones like you didn't have in the Beauty palette. But then yeah, these are, I mean, they are quite different. These two are quite similar, the two golds. The blues are similar, but this one is definitely deeper, this one is brighter. I found a shade for the pressed glitter right there, but obviously this one isn't a pressed glitter, but they do have very, very similar undertones. We have these two next, and this one is a bit more rose gold, whereas this one is a bit more cool toned. But I do think you can mix a couple of shades in here to get a similar shade. I use the shade here for the bronze, but I think if you mix down a little bit of this kind of more cool tone bronze, you would get more of a similar shade. The pink I compared to this red. Honestly, they're not super similar, but I wanted to compare them anyway. So those are the shades in here that I feel like are similar. Not the most similar palette, but again, a couple of shades that overlap. The next palette I want to compare is the Norvina palette. Both of these are from Anastasia, and yeah, they're not the same by any means, but I feel like there are a couple of similarities, so I wanted to swatch them out. So these are the closest shades that I came up with. Again, there's definitely a few differences, but let's go through them. So to start from this top this time, we have quite a few similar shades actually. I feel like this is like the most similar we've been, like some of the most similar shades in the comparison. This undertone is different, but these two are quite similar. No, this one is a pressed glitter, but the shade itself is actually quite similar. The purples as well are quite similar. This one is a little bit more kind of lighter and warm toned, whereas this one's a little more cool toned and slightly deeper. These bronzers right here are quite similar. This one again is a bit deeper, whereas this one is a bit lighter and slightly more shinier. Then when we get to this end, it does kind of differ a little bit more. We have these two comparisons here. This one has a gold shift, this one doesn't have as strongly, and this one is also more of a kind of pastel bright pink, whereas this one is a bit more muted. For the browns, this one here is quite similar, which is the shade Electric. That one is definitely a worthy dupe, I would say, for like these two shades. Not exactly the same, but like it definitely gives the vibe. However, this one here, which is the shade Incense, is definitely more cool toned, which I didn't realize until I swatched out, but I wanted to keep it in anyway. Then for the last two shades here, this one here is definitely more kind of purpley toned than this here. It's almost like a mix between these two shades and this here. So not exact, but again, you get the deepness from this palette. And then this one here, I think is quite similar. However, this one is a shimmer and this one is a matte. Then the last palette I want to compare with the Anastasia Amrezy palette is the Nabla Dreamy palette right here. Again, not that many similar shades, but I did want to pull them out because I feel like there are a couple. But I'm going to go through this briefly because again, you can see that it's not, it's less than half the palette. These two shades here are quite similar. This one is a little bit more cool tone than this shade here, but they are quite similar. This, I would say the pink is almost identical. This one needs a little bit more purple, whereas this one only sticks to like pink. Up here, these two pinks are definitely not the same. There is like similar vibes, but not the same at all. I wouldn't say they're even close to being dupes. The golds or the like warm tone yellowy golds are quite similar. You know, not the same, but definitely more similar. One of the most similar shades in the comparison. The purple shades as well. This one is deeper. This one is lighter. They're both purples. They're both like the same type of purple, like undertone wise. But this one is definitely deeper. Again, I have found something similar to pressed glitter. That one is like a rose gold, similar to the pressed glitter, but obviously not the same because it's not a pressed glitter. And then we have a highlighting shade as well. This one is definitely more shimmery, more kind of white gold, whereas this one is a bit more pink leaning. But those are the comparisons with the Nabla Dreamy, and yeah, nothing too similar. I've noticed that this palette is actually harder to dupe out than I thought because it has like a good mix between the pinks and the kind of more warm tone shades. So it's getting hard to like dupe it out. Yeah, it's definitely a lot of palettes that have a couple shades, but nothing that is exact. So here you have my dupe of the Amrezy palette. I'm pretty happy with it. Some shades are not the same, but I also included a couple more exciting shades, which you can see in the swatches. Like some of them have shifts, some of them might not look exact straight on, but it's something that I would be more inclined to use. So those are the shades right here, but let's go through the swatches. Starting up here, we have the light highlighting shade. I have a deposit shade from the NYX In Your Element Air palette. It's just a light beige. Next to that, we have the shade that is dupe for Barb. It's not exactly the same, but it is very, very similar, and that is the reformulated version of Sunbeam from Cleona. Next up, we have a pressed glitter. This pressed glitter is actually, it's not the same, but it's actually better than the one in the Amrezy palette, and that is Overpacked from Colourpop. Here we have from Sydney Grace, we have the shade Dear Reader, which is that kind of purple shade right there, which is quite similar actually. Here we have the powder shade from the Tri palette in the shade Shaga, which is that gold, again very, very similar. For the blue, we have a Cleona eyeshadow, which is actually a multichrome, and it's more exciting, I feel like, than the one in the palette, but it does have a very, very similar undertone, and that is the shade Crown Jewel. Next to that, we have this shade here, which is one of the hollow shades from Glam Shop. This is the shade Slotte Hollow, which I think means gold hollow. So yeah, that one is in a pressed glitter, but I feel like it gives a similar effect. Then lastly, on the first row, we have the shade Boozy from Colourpop. It's a little bit more kind of rusty than the one in the palette, but I don't use these deep kind of bronzy shades very often, so I feel like that's a good enough dupe. On the second row, the first shade we have is this one here, which is another kind of multichrome shade comparison, and that is Flare Star from Terra Moons. Again, it gives like that bright pink effect, but it's definitely more exciting to me. Next up, we have another Sydney Grace shade. I think a lot of the rest will be Sydney Grace. This one is the shade Lucky Peach, and it's that like pink to gold shade right there. Then we have two more Sydney Grace shades. First up, we have the shade Red Start, which is this one here. And then next to it, we have the shade Taffy. They're not exact, but I feel like I wanted to have a little bit more variety between these two shades, which I feel like I gave, but I still got the same overall effects. Next up, we have a Terra Moons eyeshadow, and that's the shade Orchid. It's one of their mattes, which I think is a very, very good dupe for that kind of burgundy shade. Next up, we have another Sydney Grace shade, and that is the shade Dark Chocolate, which is that deep brown right there. Here we have a black, which is from Colourpop, and it's the shade Let's Do It. So that's the next comparison. And then lastly, we have another Sydney Grace shade in Sweet Tooth for the last comparison. So that is my dupe for the Amazing palette. So conclusions for this palette. I feel like this is the first palette that I've done in the series. Granted, this is the third palette I'm doing. That was pretty hard to dupe out actually. Yes, in the singles, I do feel like I've gotten a really, really good dupe, as you can see. But with palettes, I don't have anything really like it. Does that mean I'm going to keep it or declutter it? I don't know yet. I'm going to keep doing this series, and I'm going to make a decision. As of now, I don't think I'm ready to declutter it. I do like this palette a lot. It was also a gift from my boyfriend, which is nice. But yeah, overall, I do feel like right now I want to hold on to it the way it's looking. But it might be something that I want to pan in the future, or just like roll in singular shades in different product pans and stuff like that. We'll see, but yeah, for now I haven't really quite made my decision up on it yet. But I do think, leaning from just the swatches and today, I think I'm more leaning towards keeping it. So that was this palette. Let's move on to the Jackie Aina. Next up, we do have the Jackie Aina palette, like I said, and here are the swatches of it. You can see right there. So let me pull out the first palette and start comparing. First up, we have a palette that isn't super similar, but there's definitely a couple overlapping shades, and that is the Stone Vibes palette from Urban Decay. I have swatched out the similar shades, and as you can see, there's only a couple. I would say there's only really 4 true ones, but I have also swatched out this one here, which is the shade Antidote. That one isn't very similar. It's way lighter than the shade Ginger, but I wanted to swatch it anyway. The most similar colors are definitely these two right here. This one here is the shade Bloodstone, which is quite similar to Sponsored. And then we have this one here, which is the shade Hexed, which is similar to Edges. The purple is not the same at all, but you know, they're both purples. And then this one here is kind of similar, not the same though, which is the shade Tiger's Eye and Sam. So yeah, those are the only similar shades from this palette. The next palette I have, which is definitely more similar, is this one here, which is the Pat McGrath Bronze Seduction palette. So I have actually found a match for every single one shade here, which I have swatched out. Most of them, like some of them aren't exact matches, but you can see there's a lot of similarities between these two. So let's go through the palette like in order. First up, we have the lightest shade in the Pat McGrath palette, which is very, very similar to this lightest shade in the Jackie Aina palette. Then for this brown here, it's this one here. This one here is definitely more kind of cool tone and a little bit darker than this one, but definitely similar again. This here is probably the most different shade, which is this one here, which I have compared to Dwellers. And you can see like this one is definitely more green leaning. This is more kind of just bronzy leaning, and that's them two right here. Then this next shade is this one here, which is actually a quite comparable shade to Sam. Sam is a little bit more golden, whereas this one is a little bit more rose gold. But you can definitely see like the similarities. This one is a very sparkly shade, but you can see how much more sparkly the Pat McGrath shade is. For the next shade here, we have compared it to Sponsored, which, you know, again, not the same. This one is definitely, it doesn't have a base, and also it's a little bit more green, whereas this one is a little bit more teal, but similar again. For the second row, we have the two purples compared, and then this one is compared to Lithuanian, and that is the shade here and here. So again, similar. This one is a little bit different. It's not as bright, but definitely similar vibes. The deep brown I obviously compared to Credit, the deep brown in the Jackie palette, and you can see the shades there. The one from the Pat McGrath is a little bit deeper again. I think that's the overall theme for the mattes. But I know as well with the Pat McGrath they can easily be sheared out, so I don't think like it's too much of a deal. Then for the last two shades right here, we have obviously compared it to the red shade, which is almost spot on, but the Pat McGrath shade is way more intense. And then lastly, we have this like kind of iridescent gold shade, which I have compared to the iridescent gold Trust Issues in the Jackie palette. And again, a lot of similarities, which I didn't really realize before opening up these next to each other. Obviously, there's only 10 shades in here, and there's 14th in here, so the kind of pinkier shades like these two here, as well as the purple shimmer here. Which one else have I not compared? Oh yeah, also edges here. So these 4 shades don't really have a comparable shade, but obviously a lot of overlap. And I think this is probably the closest like dupe that I have of this palette. But I mean, I say dupe, but this one is way more high quality. And this is definitely the palette I prefer to the Jackie palette. But I used happy to compare them because there is a lot of similarities. Next up, we actually have another Pat McGrath comparison, and this one is the Moonlit Seduction palette. And I do feel like there's a lot of similarities here too, which is very, very surprising. I feel like this one almost have those purpley tones that the Brown Seduction was missing. And the only shade really that it doesn't have is that bright pink, which you obviously can't see. But looking at the palettes at first, like you might not see the similarities, but then when you start looking at shade by shade, there's definitely a lot of overlap. So let's go through them. First up, we have this lighter shade here, but the one in the Moonlit Seduction is definitely more cool toned and lighter. These two shades here are very, very similar. We have the shade Pinker and this one here. Those are almost dupes. Same with Big Wig and this one. Big Wig looks brighter in the pan. It's slightly brighter, but not much of a difference. Then we have Golas and this one here, which is this kind of bronzy shade. Again, this one is a little bit more bronzy leaning, whereas this one has a little bit more green to it, but similar shades. The most different are probably these two here, because this one is definitely more grey leaning, whereas this shade here is has a lot of warmth to it, and you can see that in the swatch. But you know, they're kind of deepening up shades, but not really the same. Next up, we have Lithuanian compared to this shade here. I feel like this one looks like they're in the pan, but they come off quite similar. This one doesn't have as much reflection, and this one is a little bit more purple leaning, while this one is a little bit more like taupey grey leaning, but very, very similar shades again. Next up, we have these two, which is this gold here, as well as Sam. So those two are, again, very, very similar. This one is a little bit more orange leaning, whereas this one is a little bit more like cool toned kind of gold, but similar shades again. For the next couple of shades, we don't have anything, so no red, no purple, no kind of gold iridescent, and no warm toned browns. But lastly, we do have this really, really intense shifting shade, which is very similar to Sponsored. This one is more green leaning in this case, whereas this one is more like blue. With the other palette, this one was more kind of green, like the comparison. But here you have kind of more blue, but you can see they're kind of similar, but this one is way more intense and it has more of a shift as well. So again, that is the overview of this palette. And I do feel like this palette here, in collaboration with the Brown Seduction, so like if you compare these two palettes, I feel like they will cover this palette basically all of the shades, again, apart from Supreme. But yeah, I can see there's a lot of overlapping shades, which is quite interesting. But like I said before, the quality in the Pat McGrath palette is obviously a lot better. The next palette to compare is the Love palette from Natasha Denona. As you can see here, this one has a lot of the pink tones and the purple tones that this palette has. So I'm going to show you the swatches in a second, but yeah, just remember that the warm tone shades obviously isn't in this palette, but there's more shades than I thought that overlap, so let me go ahead and show you those. So here are the swatches, and again, Some shades aren't the same, but there's definitely a lot of similarities, like I said. Again, these kind of more warm tone shades down here. So first of all, these 4 here aren't in the palette at all. Same as this shade here. So these 5, I didn't find any comparison for, but let's go through the rest. First up, we have this one here, which is the shade Soleil compared to the shade Transparent. This one is a bit more pinky tone, but they are similar. Then we have Supreme compared to Intense. Again, very, very similar shades. These are quite, like, it's not exact dupes, but very similar. We have Pinky compared to Heartbeat, and then Big Wig compared to Trust. And again, those two are very similar shades. Like I said, for Drawless, we don't have any comparison. So let's skip over to the next one, which is Credit. And I have compared that one to Commitment. Commitment looks quite deep in the pan, but it definitely is of cream to powder, so it shears out. This one is a little bit more purple leaning, while this one is a little bit more just warm brown, but very similar shades again. For Literation, I compared Blind, which isn't really the same type of color, but you know, they're both kind of silvery taupes, but this one is more silver, whereas this one is more taupe. And then for this one here, we have Sam compared to Lifetime. Those two right there are quite similar. Again, not exact dupes, but similar. For Wiggly's, we don't really have something super similar, but I compared it to Passion. Passion is definitely more purple though, but I thought I would compare them anyway. For Shookington, we have the shade Pure Love, which is, this one is more warm tone and this one is more cool toned, but both of them are purple. And then, like I said, for the rest of the palette, we don't really have comparison, but there's definitely a lot of the same vibes as the more pinky side of the palette, obviously. So it's quite interesting to compare. I thought initially that I wouldn't compare these two because maybe there's just like 1 or 2 shades that are the same. But that's what I mean. There's more shades than I thought that are similar, especially like these kind of like you know, Sam and this one here. I didn't really expect. I was mainly expecting like, you know, Supreme, Big Wig, and then maybe like Pinker. So these 3 here to be similar. But I didn't realize the palette would cover so much of the Jackie Aina palette. So I was going to compare one more palette, but I decided not to, and that was the what's it called, Red Dragon palette from Odin's Eye. I was going to compare these two, but I feel like there's not that many similar shades when I look at them one by one. I think Dollars will be similar to this shade Solar Flare. Maybe Credit would be similar to Claw, but Claw is more kind of mustardy undertone, whereas this one is more kind of warm brown. So I don't think they would be the best to compare. Maybe actually Fire would be better, but this one is more red tone. And then obviously maybe Yin and Edges, but again, I think the undertone is different. You know, maybe like one of these would fit one of these, but again, I don't think there's a lot of overlapping shades, so I'm actually going to skip this palette, but that would have been the last one I compared. So let's move on to the singles next. So here is my dupe when it comes to the singles. Might look a little bit different. I don't know how it looks in the camera. A lot of these are multi-chromes, so they sometimes show up a bit different. But let me show you the swatches. So here are my swatches. Again, you know, not exact, but I'm going to go through each shade. So first up here, we have the shade Soleil compared to, it's a Black Friday shadow from the Pastel Roses. It doesn't have a name on it. I just got it as a free gift with purchase, so I don't know what it's called. Next up, we have Supreme compared to Not That Serious from Terra Moons. This one definitely looks brighter in the pan, but when it's sheared out, it's quite similar actually, so I decided to compare that. Next up, we have 2 Colourpop singles. We have the shade Silk Street and then the shade Filtered. They're both the Polyphone palettes, and you can see them here. The only thing is I feel like the first one is a little bit too purpley, so the difference between these two aren't as big as it is in the palette, but I mean, these two are very similar as it is. Next up, we have, I think is it Cesium? Yeah, from Terra Moons, and I compare that to Drawless. Drawless is definitely a bit more warm tone, but I feel like this one is more intense and it's more fun, so I decided to go with that one as a comparison. Next up, we have another Colourpop mini shadow. This one, I haven't marked this one. I can't remember what this one is called. I will put it on screen if I can find it. I know this one was departed from the Mar palette. So it's a deep brown from there, but that is the next one, which I compared to Credit, and those are here. Lastly, for the first row, we have the shade Veil Nebula from Terra Moons, and that is compared here to Literation. Very similar kind of tones, but this one again is a multi-chrome and it has more kind of color sparkles in it, which is really fun, but I feel like those two are similar. Then we have one shade that was really, really hard to find a dupe for, and that is the shade Sam, because it's so sparkly and it's just a different kind of like reflectiveness. Like it has like a rose gold kind of undertone with gold sparkles, and I couldn't find anything similar to that really. This one is the closest shade I can get, which is from Cleona, and it's the shade Eras. So it's a really, really pretty shadow, but this one is definitely more kind of pinkly, where this one is a little bit more gold, but I think they are comparative. Next up, we have the shade Kiln from Cleona again. It's going to have a lot of Cleona coming up, but this one here is like a multi-chrome. It's one of the jewel multi-chromes, and it has like a red to kind of gold green shift. I don't know if you can pick it up on camera. You know, this one has a black base, so it's a bit deeper, but I feel like they are kind of similar, and I don't reach for kind of pure red shadows that often, so I thought this one would be a fun alternative. Next up, we have another Cleona jewel multi-chrome. This one is the shade Flame Blown, which I compared to Shookington, and they're actually surprisingly similar. Again, this one has a black base, but you can't see it as much as in Kiln. Next up, we have the last Cleona eyeshadow, and this is the shade Gilding, which I have compared to Trust Issues. You can see them there. Gilding is way more intense, but the kind of shade of the sparkles are very, very similar. There's a very kind of just yellowy gold shimmer, so I thought this would be the most similar color. Next up, we have, I think, a Sydney Grey shade. Yeah, we do. We have Piper's Piping, and then we also have the shade Under the Sea, which I have compared to Edges and Sponsored. So those two are very similar to the original shade. The only thing is the Under the Sea doesn't have as much of a brown base as Sponsored, but I feel like if I put it on top of the shade here, I feel like it would have a very similar effect, and it's the most similar in tone that I have to Sponsored. I do have more intense kind of blue, green, to brown shifting shadows. I do also have some in palettes, but when it comes to my singles, this one was the most similar in tone. So I thought I would include that one, even though it isn't the most kind of shifty when it comes to like that brown undertone. And then lastly, we do have a Colourpop shadow, and this is from the Yes Please palette, and it's the shade Note to Self, which I have compared to Ginger. So that is my dupe of the Jackie Aina palette. One last glance before I wrap up the video. So that was it, you guys, for today. Let me move out these singles out of the way and pull back in the Amrezy palette. So there we have the two palettes. From this video, my conclusion is that I feel like the Jackie Aina was easier to dupe out than the Amrezy actually. You know, I think I don't have a palette specifically for either of these palettes that covers every single shade, but I feel like if I combine a couple palettes, I do cover both of these a lot. As of now, I do kind of have a vague plan for the Jackie Aina palette. I will maybe discuss that in a different video. I think at the end of the year I will do something with it. I will maybe combine it with a different Anastasia palette. That's all I'm going to say for now, but that might be a plan for this palette, and I can just keep my favorite shades. With this palette, for now, I'm leaning towards keeping it. Again, I might pan my favorite shades. I might, you know, this might be a panda palette one year. It would be a pretty good panda palette, to be honest. It's just a lot of dark shades though, which I don't wear every single day. But this is probably a palette that I feel like I'm, after this video, more inclined to keep, because it is more unique, especially the color story of like the warm tones with the pinks. Whereas the Jackie Aina palette, like I said, I am leaning towards not getting rid of every single shade, because I feel like some shades in here are very special, and the formula is also really, really good, but to maybe combine it with a different palette. So that is going to be it for today, you guys. I really, really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Let me know what you think of the series. This is the second installment. If you haven't seen the first one, I will link it down below. I will keep doing these until I've gone through all of the palettes on my shopping block, so you can look forward to another one in a couple of weeks. But yeah, I hope you're having a lovely day wherever you are, and I will catch you in my next one. Bye, guys.